Oh, you gonna do me
Didn't even
like
didn't even
that?
count.
Yo, I like it. Keeping them guessing. They don't even know. We have been described as having a lot of chemistry. But there's another podcast where people describe the two hosts, or one's a temporary host, as having
Hmm.
chemistry. I will add, however, that I feel, Eric, our sexual tension is a lot better. Okay, it's a lot more intense than that other podcast of which we will not name, but we have a guest that comes from that podcast today.
Yeah, I would say our sexual tension is tense. I wouldn't
Yeah,
even say it's intense. It's like
taut,
yeah, there's a lot of tension, and which is
rope-like.
good because tension is a
Yeah.
critical aspect to hypertrophy.
Ooh.
So I'd like to say that our sexual tension makes both of us, bigger.
It does.
Both like acutely and chronically.
Chronically. Yep. That's an accurate statement. And it's just, I was amazed because we had not one, but two pro natural bodybuilders that have PhDs that are called, now I'm confused. Eric Helms, his name was Eric Trexler that we had on.
I thought, Derek Trexler, I believe is his name.
No,
and just to give a little
coach,
bit of a shout out to
yeah.
Derek.
Yeah.
He's not only a pro natural bodybuilder, he's also a pro classic physique. So he's very much the Bo Jackson of strength sports. He's
Wow.
multiple different highly divergent sports and characteristics he's a pro in.
Well, Coach, I never would want to correct you on anything, but I want to just say that I believe his name is spelled Derek, so Derrick, but the D is silent, and so it's actually Eric Trexler. But you spell it like Derek.
Oh, no, and it's a two-way street. I don't want to correct you, but
Right.
I think I said it. I said it wrong. I think it's actually Aaron Trexler.
Oh, yeah, no, okay. So it's silent at the end. That makes sense because I kept saying the two Erics, and he
I
just
think
looked.
it's Nordic.
Yeah.
Maybe it is the D is silent and the K or the C is pronounced with an N. I think
Yeah.
that's I mean, that might be like Swedlandic or something.
I just want to, yeah, Coach, I just want him to know. I actually said plainly after in the DMs, after we had Eric Trexler talking about metabolic adaptation, having a great time. He's like, hey, man, love being on the podcast. I said, thanks. You're my second favorite, Eric. And that's a true statement.
And he was probably a little confused because his name is Aaron or Derek, one of the two.
Darren.
All I know is I don't think his name is Eric.
Yeah. I'm
That's the
pretty
only thing
confident
I'm
on
sure
that.
of.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I would know. He just recently joined Mass, and I listened to the Stronger by Science podcast. And I will say, I think, credit where credit is due. It is the very first fitness podcast.
Yeah.
And I think they do a good job. But I think probably some of their success just has to being the first to market. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, it's never been done before. And what a wholly original, unique concept for two people to talk about fitness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, if someone else was to then do that, it would be pretty derivative, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it'd be really strange, too, if... what episode are we on, Coach?
I think this is like either 29 or 30. 30 maybe? This is the 30th episode, 31st?
Yeah, right around there. It'd be the 30th episode. It's kind of weird that we have 30 episodes and they have something like 13 or 14. But I guess, of course, when they make the claim that they're the first fitness podcast, we transcend the mere fitness moniker. And so we become so much more. It's a cultural, societal, historical, scientific exploration of lifting culture. So, of course,
that's them showing us respect. They don't want to bring us down to kind of the more, I don't want to say pedestrian, but I'll go ahead and say pedestrian podcast that they're doing, So shout out to Derek and temporary guest host Greg for not, trying to diminish what we're doing. And, great job being the first in a small pond. You guys are the two big fishes there. You're really, really crushing it in that almost more of a fishbowl, I would say.
Yeah, that's why I just, I want to say that I'm proud of us for giving Aaron Trexler the opportunity to be on, and it is an opportunity to be on our podcast. And so it's always important to give shout outs to up and comers, up and coming podcasts, people that deserve the opportunities.
Really, we're trying to put the ladder down, to make sure we can lift people up. So everyone who's tuning in, you probably haven't heard of this guy, but definitely give him at least some level of respect and your time. If you make it to the first 15 minutes, we appreciate that, and I know Derek does too.
Yeah, so guys, just enjoy this episode. Keep an open mind, and we got two pro natural bodybuilders talking about lifting. What's hotter than that?
Nothing.
You got to think about that for a second. I don't know if I'm seeing double here, but it appears we now have two Captain Americas. I want to set the scene for everyone out there. We have two individuals named Eric on this episode. We have two pro natural bodybuilders. I want to stress the natural component. We have two PhDs, and I just want to know from you gentlemen if this is closer to Dostoevsky's The Double in terms of your relationship, or is it closer to the seminal film Jean-Claude Van Damme's Double Impact? I'm just wondering which of the two, or even maybe let's throw in a third one. Is it like Highlander? There can only be one.
So I'll chime in first, then I'll let Dr. Trexler go ahead. I think it's a little more like Multiplicity. Classic film, one of the best that Michael Keaton's done.
Yep.
And if you remember, at a certain point, the copies started to really degrade. That's kind of how I see it, and then you can assume which one of us is which by age, and I am older, so. But that's just my impression.
Right.
So, a fun fact about me is that I've seen almost no films at all, so I don't get any of these references.
One was a book, though. Don't worry about that one.
Oh, I don't read.
Okay. Yeah. No.
Absolutely not.
I just don't consume media at all. Yeah.
I really don't. It's crazy. I don't consume any media. Whichever is the most adversarial, I will default to that option. Eric and I have had a pretty public spat going on for quite some time. There's a lot of bad blood between us. And one of us will eventually come out on top, and it'll probably be a couple decades of battling before we figure out who that is.
Well, I appreciate you, Eric. I'm going to refer to you for the rest of the episode as Trexler or T-Rex because Eric Helms, Sir Helms, Captain America, gets first choice here.
Well, I've always just referred to him as first name Aaron. It is Aaron Trexler, right?
It is actually Eric.
Got it. Sorry. I keep forgetting.
Well, you spend a lot of time thinking about yourself and speaking in third person, so it should come really naturally for you.
Got it. Thank you very much. So Dr. Derek Trexler is here with us.
Yeah.
Close similarity to my name.
Guys, I am so glad, gentlemen, we're able to put this animosity behind us. One just, I think, final point that I want to bring up, if I can, T-Rex, Trexler, and that is I understand that you do with Greg Nuckols a podcast, the first ever fitness podcast, Stronger by Science. And I've heard it. I've heard you guys refer to Eric Helms. I think it's really great. And you guys put forth that you're the first podcast. And I think the more of us that contribute towards creating good content is only excellent for everyone involved. At Iron Culture, we have the ethos of history, science, culture, trying to bring it to the people, for the people. And to that end, we've actually been fortunate with a lot of our reviews on iTunes where people contribute. We have supporters and they leave them, and typically they go something like this, where someone, L, said, best fitness podcast I've ever listened to. 5 stars, 5 out of 5. So glad someone is finally speaking to these topics. As a science and history buff who loves to lift, I'm glad someone is doing this. Also hearing 4 dudes acknowledge gender disparity in lifting is almost as euphoric as a morning hit of creatine. Very nice. We've been very fortunate. But there's one review that stood out to me, and I don't know if you know this, but when you leave a review on iTunes, it says your name on it. And surprisingly, it was a 1-star review, and it was only 2 words, and it said shit sandwich. And it was written by E. Trexler, the username. So I'm just curious if you want, this is cleaning duties for Iron Culture. We want to let everything out in the open. I'm just curious, Mr. Trexler, if you want to comment on that, say anything about it before we go on.
I think it's pretty clear. I mean, do you need me to elaborate more on that? I mean, it's a pretty straightforward review.
Now, so I told Omar that it couldn't be you because you don't make typos and your name is Derek Trexler, as we've already established. So it would have been D Trexler. I know the E is right next to the D, and I just didn't see you making a typo like that because he referred to you as Mr. Trexler, but Derek, I'm going to give you the proper honorifics. Dr. Trexler doesn't make typos. I'll say that. So
also,
apologies.
It's okay. When I got my PhD, I actually did legally change my first name to Doctor, so I don't go by E Trexler anymore.
Interesting.
Is that? I was trying to play along. Is that a real thing?
Is that a real review?
No.
Oh man!
No, of course not. No one never
so
say that about
happy.
our culture.
No.
I would have been so happy if somebody put those words in my mouth, and I'd gladly own them.
Well, I'm just excited for another shit sandwich episode of Iron Culture. Talk about metabolic adaptation. If you've made it this far, you're in for a real treat. Eric Helms.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Omar and I will happily be the shit to the the delicious filling of this sandwich, which is Eric. So Eric, I know you've been on a few podcasts to talk about metabolic adaptation, but I'm actually really looking forward to this discussion with you because that's kind of where we first connected and collaborated. We spent a lot of time writing and putting out content on that together, where we kind of speculated on the full spectrum of metabolic adaptation and among bodybuilders specifically, all the way from when they're attempting to gain lean mass and they may have I would say an elevated total energy expenditure, all the way down to the kind of the bare bones of contest prep. And I think we were able to do a pretty good job of explaining why sometimes we just see what I would call crazy crap when people report what their actual macros and calories are online. Like, I'll use myself as an example. With only, say, a 25-pound difference from my stage weight to off-season, sometimes there is a 1,500 calorie disparity where it seems like I'm at or close to maintenance in both cases. And I think a lot of people who are very much focused on just plugging the numbers into a calculator, doing the 3,500 calories per pound of fat mass math, thinking about, the differences in TDEE, just kind of rail against that, especially if they've come from, I would say, probably a less informed, maybe a little more old school, too rigid place of science-based kind of thinking, hashtag science versus actual being evidence-based, where they think metabolic adaptation is somewhat of a myth, maybe because it got overhyped by certain individuals, calling it things like metabolic damage or implying that it's permanent and therefore buy my supplement or buy my program, etc. So anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Is that an accurate framing?
I think that is accurate, and I think you and I find ourselves in the really unfortunate position of not being extremely emotionally attached to it, which makes us what an expert would call boring as hell. So when I talk about metabolic adaptation, I tell people it's something that really ought to be thought about and definitely shouldn't be worried about. It is a thing that seems to happen. We don't have a perfectly clear understanding of it as it pertains to bodybuilding and all the potential applications of what to do about it. But we at least know enough to plan for it. And we also know that it is not something that's going to absolutely stall you and lock you dead in your tracks and completely sabotage a contest prep. So, I think you and I have talked about in previous writings, why it seems to be a huge effect where it's really actually a fairly modest effect. And then, we've kind of speculated about what you might want to do about that. But yeah, I think that's pretty accurate that our eyes deceive us when we get too locked into some of those theoretical calculators. And it's a thing that exists, but it's not a thing that is catastrophic by any means.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think we're also dealing with a lot of extrapolation. And I think that's going to change now that we're seeing almost this kind of gold rush of bodybuilding studies getting published, where we're going to be getting more and more data, and hopefully more than just case studies on the actual metabolic adaptations to contest prep, which I'd love to talk to you about some of the research you've actually done and published in that arena. You're one of the few, to where we're basically extrapolating from studies on obese individuals. And that's simply not the same thing. And I think I would love to hear how much do you think us looking at arguably the more beneficial research for society, figuring out how do we combat the obesity epidemic, how do we help people with obesity or with overweight to maintain weight loss, to help them be healthier. there is certainly concern or a component where we need to maybe address metabolic adaptation. I think it's probably more behavioral in nature where we need to set our sights, but absolutely we can't deny that there is a mathematical slight barrier or an impediment that makes it harder to maintain weight loss. How much can we extrapolate from studies on the obese individual who has lost weight to someone who is, say, a fitness enthusiast or a bodybuilder who's trying to lose weight to get down to reasonably lean, kind of your typical desire of your average lifter is to get to what they would consider like quote unquote beach lean, and then just stay there forever and be able to magically make gains but not ever gain body fat. Like, that's probably not realistic, but is it the same to try to get down to a lean level and maintain it versus trying to get down from an unhealthy level of body fat to less and maintain it?
Well, it's definitely not the same. And I feel like with each component of that puzzle, some aspects are more generalizable than others across populations. But I think that's one of the most challenging things about writing about this topic was I recently wrote like a really long article about it, and it ended up being a lot longer than I intended because I felt like there were a bunch of caveats I had to keep throwing in, and I'd think, oh, this might be a strategy worth mentioning, and then that's another entire section. But the hardest thing to me was trying to write about it while also putting in the caveat saying, well, this applies to someone going from obese to normal weight, using like the clinical terminology, not trying to be a dick and say something's normal or abnormal, but you know what I mean.
Sure. To a BMI classification below what is currently categorized as underweight.
Correct. Yeah. So going from a lot of excess adiposity to kind of like a healthy body weight versus going from a healthy body weight to an extremely lean body weight. These are very, very different circumstances. And so for each part of the puzzle, there are certain things that are going to translate a lot more poorly than others. And actually, Spencer Nadolsky brought up a really good point. Like Mike Israetel shared my article, said some nice things about it, which I appreciated. And Spencer was like, yeah, but like, I'm worried people are going to think that this applies to people going from obese to non-obese. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, that's a good point. And I certainly wouldn't want to be the person contributing to that misconception. So I'm glad that you brought that up. It's tough. And like, I hope that people will continue doing the case studies, but also branching out and saying, okay, we've got case studies. Maybe the time and resources would be better served, better devoted toward a small cohort of people that are on a similar timeline. Mm-hmm. And so as we start to get to bigger samples, we'll get a much more complete picture about exactly what translates well and what doesn't translate well from, as you said, like I wrote in 2014, I wrote a review paper on this, and it contained like one case study of a bodybuilder, and the rest was completely not bodybuilding because it just wasn't there.
Absolutely.
And so that review paper would look a hell of a lot different now, and it's only been 5 years, which is awesome.
Yeah, that is something I'm really intrigued about. And I think I totally agree with you. Like, we need more interventions and cohort, even just observations of large numbers of folks getting really, really lean to get a better idea of this. I think a huge, like the classic representation of what we use to think about what happens to bodybuilders has always been the Minnesota semi-starvation study. And I think the classic interpretation of it is, hey, they were burning 15% less calories than expected based on their body weight change or something like that. Or only 15% of it could be attributed to true metabolic adaptation if we're talking about the metabolic rate component. But I think one thing that is very useful about case studies is it gets us out of that constant trap of looking at the mean and assuming that is the change when we use science. And I think that was something that was really unfortunately paraded around too much with the Minnesota semi-starvation study. I would hear 15%, 15%, 15% over and over and over again as an expectation of what would change. And that was kind of before we had that communal understanding that perhaps NEAT was driving these big adaptations. And yeah, it may only be, a 5, 10, or 15% adaptation to actual metabolic rate beyond what would be predicted by weight loss. But maybe there's another component that's going down here, because if you look at some of the research that is in obese people who have, say, lost 10% of their body weight, while the mean might be they're burning 10% of their total daily energy expenditure less than expected, it only takes you to look slightly to the right after that plus or minus symbol and look at that standard deviation and realize just how broad of a spectrum that is. There was, I think, one specific study, if you were to go out 2 standard deviations from the mean, we're looking at more like 27, 28%. And if you go full 3 standard deviations and cover almost everybody, you have a full 1/3 less than the total expected energy expenditure. And that actually starts to explain some of the things we see, versus us dismissing every single case of someone reporting online that, I can't lose weight despite eating 1,600 calories and I weigh, 190 pounds or 180 pounds, as you don't know how to track, you're lying, you have some kind of pathological condition, you're waking up in the middle of the night and eating peanut butter. And granted, all those things do happen, don't get me wrong, but I think it is probably inaccurate to dismiss all of them based on that. So I see that's the one value in case studies, is it does give us this more rigorous look at a N of 1 kind of evaluation, when previously it was just an anecdote on the forums.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I like about, I forget the author of the paper, but it is one of the papers that really does a really good job of documenting the variability in how people increase their energy expenditure when they're overfed in experimental conditions. And they really focused in on the variability and some of the individual changes and the range of those changes. And part of me thinks...
You talking Levine 98, where they talked about the one person who was up like 600 calories more than the average?
I think that might be it, yeah.
Yeah. It's a good paper.
But it showed this very different responses, and that entire body of literature consistently shows that the response to overfeeding, some people have this really nice adaptive increase in total energy expenditure that really attenuates their weight gain. And I almost feel like we look at that particular body of literature from this like biased lens that makes us start looking for it, because we all know that one person that eats like just like complete shit and doesn't gain weight, and I feel like everybody secretly hates them and is like, we have to find these people.
It's not a secret, bro. People just hate you to your face. George,
yeah.
I'm talking to you with your cookies and your 9% body fat. Screw you, George.
Exactly.
And he doesn't even want to be lean.
No, he doesn't want to eat cookies. He's trying to get huge. Yeah. And he's like, I just can't eat enough. Like, George, you know what? Go run marathons. Nobody wants you in our community.
Yeah. So I wrestled in high school, and there was one year that I had to eat my way up 2 weight classes, and it actually was difficult to make weight because you had to weigh in at a certain minimum. And I was that person in the back of the bus going to tournaments, like, I just can't eat anymore. I feel so sick, and all my buddies are starving to death, and I did not get a lot of sympathy. But yeah, I mean, so in the literature looking at the other side of this question, we've done a really nice job approximating that variability and looking at some of these special instances of really remarkable individual cases. And hopefully we'll start doing that the same way, looking at the other side of this coin, which is what is the magnitude of variability when it comes to individuals on similar weight loss trajectories, doing similar interventions, but having divergent down regulations in energy expenditure.
Yeah, I agree that is a good direction for us to head to. And I do understand, I don't think it's just that whole, we've seen George and we want to find them, and we have this curiosity to it as well. I think it's logical that we look at the going up and the going down in different lenses, because society has defeated our ability to overcome overfeeding, at least in the West, and I think that has helped us see just how potentially asymmetric that compensation is, or at least in individuals. Some people seem very robust, like it's really hard for them to gain weight, really hard for them to lose weight, or sometimes it's asymmetric the other way, very hard for them to gain weight, easy for them to lose weight. I'd say that's an example like Alberto Nunez. I tend to be hard to gain, hard to lose at a certain point, which is interesting, at a certain point at least. But that those individual differences are really intriguing, and I think it makes sense to me if I was to put on the hat I always keep around, my evolutionary biology hat. I won't actually put it on today because my hair's looking good. Low bar for hair looking good, by the way. I know people on video are like, "What are you talking about?" But so it makes sense to me that what traits would get passed on would be those that help you survive. And I don't think defending against weight gain is something that is really like a survivorship trait that would make it here. But definitely, being able to cross the Bering Strait when there's only a random starved animal and half a berry makes sense. That's something I think that's pretty well documented. Would you agree with that it's a semi-asymmetric response to overfeeding versus underfeeding and weight loss versus weight gain?
Yeah. I mean, and it's a good point. Like, a lot of times people kind of go back to these evolutionary justifications for things to try to kind of think through why this physiology might be the case. And you're right. I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, we don't really even have a historical context for which we would develop any kind of trait of like, no, I really couldn't possibly have any more. Like, I don't think we're used to that being something that limits our ability to pass on genes. Yeah. And so, I do think that there is this asymmetry. And the thing that's interesting is seeing how an individual responds to both sides. So like you said, you're kind of hard to gain and hard to lose. Whereas Berto's a little bit different, where he struggles to gain but loses weight easily. And I honestly have been able to gain and lose weight quite easily my whole life. Mm-hmm. And I have to constantly remind myself that that's not the case for everybody.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I remember I wrestled anywhere between 119 and 160 pounds in high school.
Wow.
And then,
that's quite the range.
Yeah, my senior year, I was 140. And then within 2 years, I was almost 200 pounds. And then my last recent contest prep, I got below 140 in my most depleted state. So like I always tell people, in 7 months, I'll be somewhere between 125 and 225 pounds. And I have no idea where I'm going to fall in there. So it's really it's cool to see how people respond differently to these things. And it's what keeps people like... Omar, do you do individual coaching?
Not anymore.
Okay, so Eric, it keeps people like you and me busy trying to figure out how people are going to respond to these different things, and it's wild to see that variability for sure.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things I like to comment about, I'm going to take my evolutionary biology hat off. I'm going to go ahead and put on just my straight up biologist hat, or maybe potentially zoologist. I don't know.
A lot of hats
on my desk.
A lot of hats.
I got a lot of hats. My hair, like.
If you bring up your hair one more time, that's not what champion pro natural bodybuilder Eric Helms would say. It looks great.
Trexler has a lot of body weight variability. I got a lot of hair variability.
So can I just point one thing out? Helms, from now on, you are the carrot top of podcasting, because the whole thing here has been props and hair references. Like, you are... Carrot Top could realistically try to sue you for some of these concepts that you're borrowing.
Can we make me like the phase of Carrot Top's career where he was clearly on a ton of juice and was freaking huge, but
and never addressed it. Never addressed it.
Never addressed it.
Yeah.
Like,
I love when people do that. Clearly
like
get
you're
huge.
Hanging out with pro bodybuilders for 4 months and gained 60 pounds and dropped 2% body fat, but all good. You just went through a phase. You went through.
You guys, it's not part of the act. You're not supposed to bring that up.
Look. Yeah, no one knows what to do with that. Like, you're a comedian. I don't understand you being jacked and huge. You've broken my schema. But anyway, sorry. Back to my my zoology hat. Interestingly enough, so we see this non-consistent defense of weight gain in humans, but it's actually a very robust finding in animal models, which I find very interesting. When you look at overfeeding studies in rats and rodents, which are prey animals, it makes a lot of sense that you don't want to be carrying around unnecessary mass when your survival is much more predicated on, can you escape a predator? And in animal models, we typically see similar things we see in humans, at least in mammals, but just more exaggerated, which is a kind of a consistent finding. I don't know if you would agree with that. I haven't done the kind of level of animal research you have, but I've read a fair amount. But it's like typically the stuff that we can't get to reach statistical significance, but we see trends, It's like, bam, very consistent finding when we look at rats and rodents. So yeah, that's my speculation. I've got a lot of hats that I'm wearing today, not a lot of real data. So I'm hoping you can kind of fill that gap, because I'm basically just a guy who's having a hat party.
I haven't looked a lot into the rodent stuff on overfeeding. Just
You want
because
to borrow my hat? It's easier to read it when you're wearing it. So.
I'm gonna have to get several different hats. Because for me, I defer to the rodent stuff, and this is maybe something I should revise moving forward, but I usually only defer to the rodent stuff when there's not a viable human body of literature available. And so, like, we've got a nice little cluster of human overfeeding studies that have been good enough to get the job done for the questions I've been interested in answering to date. But yeah, there's always that time where on any particular body of literature, you start following that line of questioning beyond where the human stuff can get you. And that's where you start looking under all the rocks and you start finding the weird stuff. So like in this realm of literature pertaining to metabolism and energy expenditure, the weirdest stuff I've ever gotten into, I don't know if you've ever seen this stuff, Eric, it's the rodent models using ablation of different parts of the rat hypothalamus.
Oh man, go ahead. I'm just gonna let you talk, 'cause this should. Yeah, yep. Go ahead.
It's insane, man. Just doing ablation of different parts of the hypothalamus with different clusters of receptors that obviously dictate both feeding habits and activity level habits.
Oh, by the way, for the listener, ablation means like basically destroying it, burning it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they're interfering with the hypothalamus and its ability to actually receive and integrate these signals pertaining to the availability of energy. And so there have been some studies, and this sounds like a Frankenstein like fan fiction, but they would do these ablations and then they would conjoin the mice surgically so that they actually share a blood supply. And in some of these studies, based on which clusters of neurons they're doing ablation to in the hypothalamus, you'll run into weird scenarios where, like, one of the rodents, because the signaling was so out of whack, they were eating so ravenously that they choked to death and, like, had to be discarded. You read that in the methods section. Or this rat, because of the signaling, there was such a high satiety response it was receiving that it just stopped eating and starved to death. And so, like, it's absolutely insane when you start following some of the human concepts and saying, well, what if I went into some really mechanistic rodent stuff? And you can find some really crazy things in that literature. But yeah, the more that you look through it, this idea that weight loss is super simple and it's all straightforward and you've got two numbers to manage, in and out. On the superficial level, yes, the in and the out, energy in, energy out, that's what's dictating the real changes. But when you start looking into how all of this gets integrated and affected by the hypothalamus, that's where it starts to get really, really interesting.
I
totally agree.
I just want to say, Trexler, I don't appreciate what you did just there.
What I do?
Well, you got super gruesome when it came to what happens to the rodents, and now obviously our sponsorship with PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, is totally out the window. I know you're going to wait till we release this episode, send it to them, and then we're going to get boycotted. So well played. You're like, oh, I got a good anecdote, guys.
No, so the end of that story was that after several weeks of protesting at their headquarters of these laboratories, I got the practice shut down.
Nice. There are some back.
Yeah.
Hey,
which we fully support here at Iron Culture.
Yeah,
thank you to our sponsors.
I just want you to know quickly that you, even still, I appreciate that, T-Rex, but I want you to know that you will not, unfortunately, be part of our interstellar crew. I was considering you. We do have Eric Helms already, but I'm slightly jealous because you remind me of my brother, who I love very much, and I'd do anything for him. But where he actually is a little shorter than me, he weighs less than me. We did a dieting program where we followed about 7 years ago, and he actually was losing weight at a much more rapid pace, despite me actually eating less calories than him because we kept adjusting week to week, and he got leaner over time. But the good news, while you won't make our interstellar crew, and I say that because food's going to be scarce, myself and Eric Helms our spendthrift metabolism, where we're just hyper efficient, you could send us into the vacuum of space. Just shoot us out into the vacuum towards Alpha Centauri. Wait several million years, and we still would be just, 10% body fat after 3 million years. So we're good to go. But unfortunately, funding is an issue. And I suppose if you have to say something publicly, it's that you won't be part of the interstellar crew.
Well, that's actually a good thing, because as we kind of figured out, Helms and I are mostly the same person. So it wouldn't make sense you'd want to spread that out. And if anything could be preserved on Earth, I'll take care of that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I was talking about the other day, speaking of, starting new intergalactic societies or whatever this is.
Yep.
Interstellar. We're not going to
Interstellar.
the galaxy. Come on.
Okay. Sorry, I should be more realistic. Greg and I were talking about this. We had interviewed Brandon Roberts on our podcast, who had just done a competition, was like a week out from another. And we had just seen Helms in London, and I brought up the very jarring idea. You know how there's like the doomsday preppers who are ready for society to crumble at any moment?
Mm-hmm.
So like, could you imagine if like shit just hit the fan and you were like 6 days out and you're just like, well, I'm dead. Like if we go like 8 hours without meal access, I'm going to die. So
yeah, my body fat and my glycogen stores actually will last the same amount of time if we compared them. Yeah, I got a problem. Yep. Yeah,
so I was thinking about that the other day, and I was like, man, I'm gonna start planning my next prep based on the geopolitical climate, and make sure that society's in a good spot before I start getting that lean, because it's just not worth the risk.
Yeah.
So when I ask Dr. Trexler, so when are you gonna be prepping next? What's the situation with North Korea right now?
Yeah,
not good. No, I'm solid. I'll stick with the off season for now, man. I gotta keep bulking up.
What's going on with the Red Sea and Iran? Okay. I think you're looking at probably 20 never, Trexler, when you'd want to compete next.
Yeah.
Now, to follow up on that, I did want to ask both of you guys, speaking of that individual variability when it comes to metabolic adaptation, as coaches working with a variety of people, you brought up Eric Alberto Nunez. If someone is interested, and I thought actually I do want to give you credit, Eric Trexler, for your article on Stronger by Science, because one, obviously it's fantastic, but you do, when Spencer said, I'm worried about people that are going to read this and think it applies to them if they're obese, you state explicitly, actually, because I read it just yesterday, you said basically, if you go from 23% body fat to 18% body fat, this is inconsequential to you. And you say it from the outset. So I actually thought you did a good job prefacing that. I want to ask you guys, being coaches, and we can make the assumption that people want to get pretty darn, Eric, you said before, lean, like beach ready lean. So let's say 10% body fat. How do you start adjusting for the individual when you know that there's all these variables? And anyone.
First, I would say just to give a little more perspective on that, like basically that it's going to be a range for what people think they can maintain, and it's normally a range that's dictated by social media, not anything real. So for men, that's often you'll hear them say the 8 to 12% body fat range, and for women, you can effectively tack about another 8% on top of those ranges and get roughly the equivalent for a woman's body fat percentage. And there's just so many layers of problems with that. For one, you don't actually know what your body fat percentage is. Even if you were to get it tested, it would probably be pretty damn inaccurate. And if you got it tested frequently, it would really show you just how variable it is. And even the best quote unquote gold standard methods we have are probably only good for looking at group changes versus individuals. So, and also another thing I always ask people, it's like, hey, I want to get down to 10%. And I always ask them this question. This is a guy we're talking about. And I say, hey, if you got down to 10%, but you didn't have abs, would you stop dieting? And they're like, no, I'm trying to get abs. I'm like, so is it actually 10% or is it abs? Like, oh, no, it's a look. Okay, well, let's let go of that. And that's kind of the first step, because you have to do a lot of deprogramming, essentially. Then you also start to have to ask them, in my opinion, why do you want to get lean? And there's man, that can be sometimes quite the rabbit hole to go down. But I think what was born out of the If It Fits Your Macros community was this emphasis on numbers and the emphasis on its energy in, energy out, caloric expenditure versus caloric intake with not much of an understanding, like Trexler was talking about, that these aren't independent sides of an equation, that one directly impacts the other. As soon as you manipulate the in or the outside, the other one changes as well. And the idea that because we're numbers focused, because we have this black and white view, because we think it's all just metabolic math, therefore we get very focused on the numbers game, when in reality, the biggest barrier for 99% of people, even dedicated folks, is the behavioral parts that lead to that energy in, energy out outcome. And one thing I really like to distinguish for people is there's a difference between something that is factually correct and something that is useful. So while it is factually correct to say that a energy deficit will dictate weight loss, that if you can increase energy expenditure and that you can get yourself into a deficit while combining an energy deficit through caloric restriction, you will lose weight. And if you do resistance training, it'll be this. And here's the numbers. Here's probably what we need to follow. That's not necessarily useful. And I don't think we have, let's say, an obesity epidemic because people don't know that. I think we've gotten more and more confused about that because people haven't been able to leverage that knowledge for utility, and because people are now looking for alternative explanations. But the reality is that it's our behaviors that lead to creating that deficit that is therefore sustainable, that is going to help someone get there, rather than figuring out whether or not you need to eat 2,200 calories or 2,100 calories consistently because of metabolic adaptation. Because I guarantee you, anyone who is quantifying their suffering, which is what Berto and I and all of us at 3DMJ call people who are talking about their poverty macros, or, oh, I'm on X number of macros, that's good or bad because I'm comparing myself to someone else, or even where I was in the off season, is discounting the reality that we probably shouldn't be tracking macros our whole lives. And if the only way you can maintain 10% or let's say 20% as a woman body fat is by tracking macros, that's not actually sustainable. That's not something that is normal, and it's potentially causing more harm than good. The real goal should be to help you get as lean as you can maintain without intentional effort you're aware of. That may be a complete restructure of your life, a totally new behavioral modification to what you're doing. It's not just simply just eat until you're full, because if you have bad nutritional habits, that's going to lead to super high energy density foods that make you hungrier when you eat them, not satiated, and weight gain. But if you can induce a lot of behavioral changes that become lasting habits, then you basically see what does that result in if you adopt the right habits, things like low energy density of foods, high fruit and vegetable intake, lots of fiber, fluids that don't contain calories that are drinking in abundance, maintaining a higher step count and a higher protein intake, regular resistance training, and enjoying things like activity, and not rewarding yourself with food or seeking food to cope with stress. Like, you do all of those things, and you're going to find out what is the low end of your settling point range. And I think that is a much more important question, and it's a much more difficult outcome to tackle as a coach, because I can't tell you how many times, and I know I'm on a huge rant here, but I think it's important, that I've tried to help someone for the 10th or even 15th time, and I'm not exaggerating, get down to a quote-unquote sustainable body fat of this male who wants to have abs permanently. And they always approach it from, I just need the right combination of macros, or I need the right combination of cardio and physical activity, or I need the right combination of training, or the right foods, or like I need to do keto or not, or what have you. And they're always looking at it from this quantitative lens, that there is this solution that's numbers based and treats me like a machine, when it's almost, I'll say not even almost, it's never the case. And that's actually where the muscle and strength pyramids came from, was that I wanted to help people from this constant process of trying to help them achieve things that they already knew the answer to, of why I put behavior and lifestyle at the very bottom of that pyramid, because all of that has to be in place for that to actually occur. And then the last final piece is acceptance. Like, if you find out that you're the guy who the leanest you can maintain doing everything right and getting all those behaviors in place is a 15% body fat, you need to accept that that's the case, or you're going to be able to maybe get to a point where you can maintain 10% body fat with the eating disorder. But that's just a matter of time before something goes that's beyond you just having an unhealthy relationship with food. That's just a time bomb, in my opinion. So anyway, that's my long ranting answer to that it ends up being much more behavioral focused than doing anything about someone's individual adaptation to underfeeding.
Trexler, just before you give your input, I want to thank Coach Eric Helms for always just keeping it real. Why I respect you so much, Eric, is that you maintained my anonymity while you're describing that person that 10 to 15 times they've failed getting lean, where you said 190, wants to get abs. Guys, it's me. But I appreciate the whole time that you were talking right to my soul. And I really felt that passion, but you're like, I am not going to expose this young man. And you kept my anonymity, but I respect you so much.
We'll just call this guy Flomar Gisuf.
Yeah.
I mean, you figure out who it is. Could be male or female, but definitely a male.
Case study.
And the actual name is Omar Isuf, but not going to break anonymity. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Trexler.
I really admire the way that you plugged that book in there as well, and I'm sure it's 1999, link in the bio. So,
oh, it is a book now. That's right. It's not just a free YouTube video that was out.
Where can you find it, Eric? Out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Well, you could just go to muscleandstrengthpyramids.com if you want. But I mean, anyway.
I'm sure there's probably like 9 or 10 links that are on the screen whenever people are listening to this that are all very clickable. Can I answer it without plugging a for-profit product?
I don't know. Can you?
Yeah, I have information. I have nothing to sell, but I'm sure information works too. No, I mean, the thing I really liked about your answer was something that we've talked about before, which is getting away from the mechanical robotic viewpoint where everything is numbers driven. And the phrase you used, quantifying your suffering, I've never actually heard that phrase, but I am likely to steal it and I will pay you a commission every time I use it.
Damn
but
right.
We talked about how, I'm not a large person. So when I'm prepping, you can call it metabolic adaptation if you want, but I'm not going to eat a lot, and my calories get low. And at a certain point in my most recent prep, I was like, I'm not counting this anymore because it makes me sad when the number, when I get to the bottom of the spreadsheet and I see it, I'm like, I don't want to see this anymore. Like, I'm fine eating it, but I'm tired of dealing with the reality of it. I just want to do my thing, eat my food, train, and that's it. And I didn't count steps. I just walked to work in the morning and I walked home. And I knew that as long as I still needed to get to work a few times a week, which I ideally would, that'll take care of itself as well. And so, you and I talked about how it was just the least stressful prep I've ever had. It was very chill. All of a sudden it's showtime and I'm like, yeah, I feel lean. I think I'm ready. But yeah, I try to get people away from the numbers driven approach. I think one of the benefits of my background is that I've personally measured body composition with like every device you could hope to use, basically at least a few hundred times. Like in my laboratory, we did DEXA, we did 4 compartment models, BOD pods, BIA, BIS, anything you'd want to do. And so like if a client says, I want to focus on a number, I say, I promise you that number is not as good as you think it is. And like, I've seen the numbers a million times. Here's a million reasons why we're not going to worry about it. But I can't even imagine, though, if I were a trainer or a coach and I had to try to obtain that buy-in for this concept and I didn't have that background to lean on. Like if I wasn't the person who had done several hundred DEXAs in my life, I could say like, even if it's DEXA, I know you can see your bones in it, which makes it seem very high tech, but it's not as precise as you think for an individual measurement. But yeah, I mean, largely I kind of view it the same way you do, where when somebody talks about wanting to get that lean, you talk about what is the actual goal? Is it a number that we actually can't really approximate that well, or is it a look? And if it is a look, why? And is that realistic for you? And I think 2 things, because I don't want to just restate your answer because I thought that you nailed it. 2 things that people fail to anticipate or fail to think of on this topic. You talk about the habits. Like for me, the way I live right now, I am disgusted by myself. Like I could not maintain anywhere close to a lean physique because I literally don't move anymore. I wake up, I crawl up the stairs to my computer. I sit there for 14 hours. I eat Cheetos and I go to bed. So like I have no energy expenditure. Like if I wanted to maintain single digit body fat, it's just out of the question with my habits right now. I'd have to work more activity into my day-to-day stuff. So that's one thing, is like you have to look at like how much sedentary time do you have? And if you're not a naturally lean person and you're really sedentary because of your job or your hobbies or whatever the case is, like that's something that has to be considered. And we have to either tailor that into the goal setting process or adjust the behavior so that you're not quite as sedentary. Because like at a certain point, non-exercise activity is such a huge piece of the puzzle, metabolic adaptation or not, you know, it's has so much potential to increase your energy expenditure. And if it's not there, you know, that's a huge thing that's missing. So that's one thing to keep in mind is, yeah, the day-to-day habit kind of thing. The other thing to keep in mind, I'm blanking on the other one. I got so long-winded talking about my gross habits and how I don't move anymore.
Now you're just thinking about flaming hot Cheetos, bro.
Now I'm thinking about just dusting the Cheetos off my chest.
Well,
I'm sure it'll come back to me in 30 minutes.
Cool. Yeah. So there's actually a really good point you made here, going back to the overly reductionist quantitative perspective. I think someone who comes from that kind of mindset might go, well, if you're burning less calories, you would just eat less. It's not a big deal. You just adjust your macros. But this is where behavior still comes into it. And there's some interesting papers on this where you see this J curve. And I don't mean bench press. I mean, when you look at the energy intake habitually of individuals who go from sedentary to highly active, if you get past sedentary into the moderate levels of activity all the way up to the super high levels of activity, we're talking like manual laborers, there's a very linear relationship between energy intake and energy expenditure. It's tightly regulated. You have a normal satiety response post-meal, but it happens after you've eaten more, the more active you are. Boom, simple. But when you look at the sedentary, or actually not even sedentary, the below moderate activity, so light active, as we would categorize it, down all the way to sedentary, now that's where that J comes in. For those who are just listening, my finger's coming up from a slope to help you understand, to where there's this asymmetric intake that shouldn't be predicted by your energy intake level or your energy expenditure. You're sedentary, you're sitting on your butt all day, and that is so unnatural for humans based on where we've been for the vast majority of our time on the planet evolutionarily. Got that hat over here. Is that you now are not getting a normal satiety response to meals. And you find that there's a higher latency of satiety, and it's not as pronounced of a signal. So your energy intake regulation is poorer. So just the natural thing that happens when you're less active is you eat more. And that, yeah, sure, you could simply not eat more, having a very kind of robotic perspective, but that's unrealistic. And we see that in If It Fits Your Macros community too, like the whole idea of, right, I can fit in whatever I want and hit my numbers. But anyone who's actually tried to get really, really lean knows that trying to eat Cheetos and chocolate when you only have like 10 kcals per pound to eat is torturous. It literally makes it feel much, much harder. And if you look at some of the data on just ad libitum intake, when you go from high to low energy density foods, which pretty much looks like a clean diet, quote unquote. Like if you look at the list of what's a low energy density food, that means that there's a very small amount of calories for the weight and the volume of the food. We're basically talking fruits, vegetables, and lean meats, right? And egg whites and low and non-fat dairy. You see just going from high to low energy density, the ad libitum intake it could be a 500 calorie difference. And that's the entire deficit. And that means that's just what you eat habitually, what makes you feel satiated. So that means that simply eating one of these YOLO, If It Fits Your Macros diets that's in a deficit feels like you'd be 500 calories less than if you were doing it with a more approach that was more conducive to satiety, where you were having a higher fiber intake, a higher volume of foods. And that's something that I think a lot of folks miss out on, is just that, man, you're making this way harder on yourself. You know, you're thinking, you know what, I don't care about, I hate cardio, and I do just want to play video games and troll the forums, and I just want to eat, all the tasty foods, but hit my macros and just have protein shakes. Man, that diet's going to be absolutely brutal, no matter what your numbers are, or just a lot more hard than it needs to be.
Helms, you're a hero because you've jarred all those loose screws. You got everything unjammed up there. I did want to briefly touch on that same kind of thing where there's the aspect of quantifying your suffering, and then there's also that aspect, you've seen these people on If It Fits Your Macros type plans where they spend like 3 hours of their day planning out how they're going to make a dessert on like 85 calories. And it's going to be very hedonic. It's going to get them just enough excitement for them to be really sad when the meal's over, but they're not satiated at all. And so they get into this loop of spending really inappropriate amount of time obsessing about food and how they can combine them in a way that is going to be exciting but not satisfying. And that is a disaster, in my opinion. But the other thing I wanted to bring up, so people rarely think about, are my day-to-day activity levels conducive to maintaining a lean physique? Just generally speaking. One thing that other people, and I was like leaving a note on my phone so I didn't blank again, people often have a very skewed perspective of how low calories are going to need to get for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And obviously that depends on how lean you want to get, but like Helms, I'm sure you've been in this position. Omar, back in the day when you had clients, like a female client who will look at their numbers and say like, this is under like 1,600 calories. Something's awry. And it's like, I've got dudes that are eating under 15. So like that weigh 40 pounds more than you. So like I think people sometimes there's like sticker shock where they look at their macros, they go, "Oh my God, are you serious?" Like, no, I caught the metabolic adaptation. Like what happened? And it's like, no, like Brandon Roberts was on our show the other day, and like there were days where he was about 1,400 calories, and Brandon is a muscular adult male. Like that's a small number of calories. So like if he's getting down to 1,400, like, and you're not as big as him, yeah, you might need to get down to under 1,400, which a lot of people find to be really jarring and is a little bit unexpected.
Same story here. I've got a stage weight of around 80 kilos, and I don't want to give my lowest low numbers because that was like a very unique 2-week digging phase, but there was steady state for over a month where I had 4 to 5 days a week that were between 1,300 to 1,500 calories, on average 1,400, just like you were saying. And it did drastically change once I got my activity levels up. Not drastically, I would say 200-300 calories more. And man, when I was also driving my calories up on the way up, which is just, this is really interesting to me, the phenomenon of eating up into a show and seeing that as you start to chip away at the deficit, the maintenance calorie number is moving with it. Not necessarily completely symmetrically. It doesn't just end up completely gone, but I wouldn't say I was stalled, but I was losing at a inappropriately slow rate when I had 4 days at 1,400 and then 3 days at around 2,800 calories. And that would, if you did the math on that, would come out to around 11 kcals per pound, which is most people consider hard dieting. And what I had to get down to break that plateau was down to 10 kcals per pound. And then when I was really, really digging hard to get to alien levels of leanness, as we like to call it, more than just legally shredded, like get pulled over and the cops are going, you're too shredded. That was when
illegally shredded.
Yeah, I got to illegally shredded, and I'm very proud
Your
of
ass
that.
almost got deported.
Yeah, I mean, they did, and the only reason it didn't is because they couldn't identify it as an ass. They were like, "This is a fleshy walnut. I don't know what to do with this. I guess we'll let it through customs." But so anyway, I got down to below 9 kcals per pound on average for the week, weighing at about 180 pounds. So you do the math there, and then freak out. And for the non-Americans, it's around say 20 kcals per kg. And then at the end, where I was maintaining that same condition and not gaining weight, I had a slight bump in fullness, and then it just stayed there. I was eating between 2,400 to 2,800 calories, and with similar activity levels, at least that I'm aware of. And I do think we underestimate how much NEAT changes, because people would notice, like, hey, you're walking faster. Hey, you're bobbing your head to music. Hey, you're actually standing upright. Things like that. You're not sitting down every chance you get. And that is mind-blowing to me, that essentially my calorie intake, we capped it, we added about 500 to 800 per day, and it went from a deficit to maintenance when I was losing less than a pound a week, which should be only a 500 calorie kind of spread there. So that's cool.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point of, like, a lot of people look for a coach after they've done like a prep or bailed on a prep maybe, and they say like, I want you to supercharge my metabolism. Like, I think it's a really common misconception of like that you're going to do some kind of combination of macro trickery and all of a sudden rebuild a person who's burning way more energy than they used to. In reality, it's what you're talking about. It's the fact that people, first we can reverse whatever kind of metabolic adaptation was present from under eating acutely and from depleted fat storage and, you know, depleted lean tissue as well. So we can restore that. We can bump maintenance up with activity level a little bit. And then as we get into a surplus, we might have that additional overfeeding effect where people have a little bit of a compensatory increase. And so like, as the coach, you could try to frame that as like, I am the metabolism magician. I've rebuilt you. But in reality, all you did was you just like, we're like, hey, you've been not eating. What if we fed you?
Yeah.
And like, that's basically the strategy. But it comes back to the other point that I blanked on I was going to make. I've been on like a 3-day bender, a lot of booze, no sleep. Things are scrambled up there. But you know, we talked about how people treat it like it's this really simple equation. You've got energy in, energy out. And I was very fortunate to collaborate on a paper with a mathematician who the paper was about, it was based on some of Kevin Hall's models of body weight regulation. And what I always like to tell people is like, no, it is pretty numbers driven. Here's the equation. And it's like 3 pages and there's no numbers. It's only like Greek symbols. And you're like, what the hell's happening in here? And it's like, yes, this is the representation of that equation. It's not 2 numbers in and out.
Right. Absolutely not. Yeah. That's well said. I think also it's one thing to talk about the manipulation of calories and energy intake for the purposes of getting on stage on a single day with as much muscle mass as possible and the appearance of minimal body fat and the appearance of massive fullness, and then just maintaining a reasonably lean physique. And they're not the same. Like for example, the whole reverse dieting thing is where you can get those examples that Trexler's talking about, where someone will report their lowest low day in intake and cardio that they used probably from a position of fear, being behind and wanting to really make sure that I'm shredded. And it's almost ubiquitous that there's a point where a competitor, unless they're really experienced or has a very good coach, is over dieting, where they are actually pushing the deficit more than they need to because, damn it, I want to be sure, I want to get shredded. You know, I'm seeing high levels of cortisol and I'm looking at the scale and it's bouncing around. It's freaking me out. And I don't have a very good objective eye to tell how lean I am in the mirror. Everyone else around me looks at me and thinks I'm depleted and shredded, but I didn't see a scale drop this week just because I'm a bag of water as well, but I'm just going to go ahead and drop 300 calories and do more cardio. And then finally, you see the drop on the scale that eventually ends up being inevitable. You're super depleted and shredded, and then you start bringing calories up. And then that's the number they report. And then the next number they report is 3 months later. They've slowly built their calories up and exerted just this monstrous level of willpower to stay almost shredded post-comp after probably failing to do it their first 2 preps and only having, you know, coach guidance do it. And they're 1,500 calories higher and doing no cardio, but they've only gained, say, 6 pounds. And it looks like mostly muscle mass, and they maybe still have hints of glute striations. And you're like, oh my God, that's crazy. But when you actually do the math and you think about it, and you're like, oh, you were in a 700 calorie deficit there, and then you gained a total in terms of fullness and body fat of maybe, you know, 10 pounds. And you've not only reversed the metabolic adaptations, but now you're in a slight surplus to where you're gaining, say, half a pound a week. Oh, that makes sense. That's why it's more than 1,500 calories higher. And actually the math does work. And if you think about what if I had just, you know, not dieted as hard and then simply increased my calories by 1,200 right after the comp was over, you would be at the same place, but earlier, and you wouldn't have spent 3 months in a position where you were potentially just, you know, slowing down the process of restoring your hormonal status, restoring energy expenditure, even being even higher, etc. So I think that's one thing to realize. But it also does make it more complicated, like what you do with a bodybuilder. The time I actually do follow those kind of hardcore, probably not recommended after the season is over, reverse dieting tenets, is when we still have more shows. So, for example, I've got a competitor right now, shout out to Mark, He won his first show over in the UK, and he's diced. He has veins in his glutes, and he's competing this weekend, and he's got another show in 4 weeks. And I just increased his carbs by 50 grams. That was his last adjustment, and dropped his cardio a little bit. And that's a small increase, and it's because I don't want any gain of body fat. And I just don't want him getting flat. I want to maintain glycogen levels, and I want to see what I can get away with pushing through his system, because I can't predict necessarily what his exact response to feeding is going to be in this state. And we also know that when you have dieted down to this very, very, very lean position, your body is ready to store body fat. Once you've topped off glycogen, you get into a surplus, probably the first things that are going to start filling up, maybe after some loss of maybe some lean body mass, if that happened purely from just being over dieted, is going to be adipose tissue filling up. So I don't know if that's something you do, Trexler, but the only time I'm using that characteristic reverse dieting approach is when we're still dieting and we're actually coming into a show, and I'm trying to conservatively bump them up. But once the show's over, I get them into a surplus straight away.
Yeah, I mean, right now I've got one person that I'm currently doing that with, and it's because I'm trying to get him to stop losing so much damn weight. And so I'm like bumping because we just want to have a little maintenance period, because it's after a pretty substantial weight drop. We're just trying to kind of cut it into phases, and he just keeps on rolling. I keep adding carbs, and his weight keeps dropping. So very small drops, but am I a metabolic magician? Yes. And if you want coaching, Omar will put a little link here.
Absolutely.
StrongerByScience.com.
Right below muscleandstrengthpyramids.com.
The 9 links, yeah.
So I think maybe, one thing I'm a little concerned that we've done is we've started this conversation towards the expert side of it. And I wondered, Eric, can you bring us back to kind of some of the basic terminology here? So when we're talking about metabolic adaptation, I think what we've been really saying is adaptive energy expenditure, and we're talking about a lot of components here. Can you walk us through what the components of energy expenditure are, which ones primarily adapt, and what is the difference between a lean person and an obese person as far as what adapts?
Yeah, so when we're talking about energy expenditure, you could look at the whole pie, just total energy expenditure. But there's subcomponents of that. Certainly resting energy expenditure, or basal metabolic rate, resting metabolic rate. There are scientific distinctions, but practically speaking, they often get used interchangeably. There's the thermic effect of feeding, which is just the energy that we spend eating and metabolizing food and digesting it. We've got exercise activity thermogenesis, which is the calories we burn during exercise, which is quite we're quite able to manipulate, obviously. And then there's the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which we've talked about frequently already, which is often shortened to NEAT as an acronym. And when you look at the literature, most of the adaptive thermogenesis literature, meaning this kind of adaptive reduction in energy expenditure from weight loss, most of it, as you would expect, is done in samples of overweight or obese people. And what they'll do is they'll have them lose weight. It's usually like at least 10% of their body weight. That's kind of the number a lot of researchers use as like, okay, we've done a weight loss thing here. And usually what you'll see is that, total energy expenditure, in non-extreme cases, looking at average values, will often be about 10% less than what we thought it would be. And I know Rosenbaum and, is it Liebel? I don't know how he pronounces it. They've...
I think it's Liebel, but I could be wrong.
Liebel, yeah. So they estimate that probably about 85% of that adaptive reduction in energy expenditure that's not attributable to changes in body mass, about 85% of it they say is probably attributable to non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And there are some distinct changes that happen to other components. Resting metabolic rate drops a little bit, but usually not by a ton, to be honest. Especially, so resting metabolic rate, one of the things that makes it drop is the fact that you are acutely in an energy deficit as you are losing weight. And when you remove that acute deficit and you get somebody weight stable and they're just at a reduced body weight, usually the drop in resting metabolic rate is only like 3 to 5% in like non-extreme cases. Usually the really big part of energy expenditure that has an adaptive response is the NEAT. And NEAT, to try to like operationalize it, it's all the ways you spend energy that don't involve merely existing or exercising. So, things like maintaining posture, fidgeting in your chair, going to get the mail, washing dishes, sweeping the floor. It's these little things that actually tend to add up. And there's actually some really cool research estimating that two people of the same exact body size, just depending on how they go about their day, could vary by up to 2,000 calories in terms of the difference between one person's NEAT and the other person's NEAT. Now, that's a very extreme, that's like the boundaries of what we would see there. But you can imagine that something that has that much potential to change is a highly influential aspect when it comes to losing weight and maintaining a reduced body weight.
That's really well said. And I think one of the most important caveats of that is how that's framed. And I think a lot of people, when they look at NEAT, they just think, how sedentary are you? And that's not actually the case. In fact, there's some crazy stuff looking at epidemiology when they look at hunter-gatherer societies, and the overall society energy expenditure is not that much higher than a Western society, just showing that when you really ramp up what we would probably classify as exercise activity thermogenesis, other compartments downregulate too. And that there's almost a certain amount of cap to it, at least from a habitual sense. Obviously, if you're going to run a marathon, you're going to burn a lot of calories. It's not unoverwhelmable, but kind of just the habitual nature and the subconscious nature of NEAT can't be overstated enough, in my opinion. There's a really, really cool study, Eric. I think you remember this one where they looked at energy expenditure during moving someone's arm after weight loss, and then added external weight to it, and found that even when the weight was added back to someone's, I think it was an arm, it might have been arm cycling if I recall correctly, there was still a reduction in energy expenditure. And that's something that doesn't just affect, EAT, or exercise activity thermogenesis. That's going to affect everything. If you're simply not burning as many calories and you move your limbs, even when the weight's back on, just to show that kind of, efficiency and spendthrift nature is happening at a micro level. It's also happening during subconscious periods. Like there was basically the biodome study, as I like to call it. It was actually Biosphere 2, I think is the actual name of the study, where they measured energy expenditure during sleep, and people simply burned less calories while sleeping, which doesn't technically fall under, BMR. They were tossing and turning, not all night. They were moving a lot less in their sleep. Like these are things that we really don't necessarily have conscious control over. Postural support musculature, how much you just lean on walls and shit when you're standing around. I had a comment. I did a local seminar here with the head of Sports Nutrition Australia. Shout out Alex Thomas. And I think it was back in March, so I was about a month out from my first show. I was feeling it, but I wasn't quite. I was getting stopped by the police, but they're going, "All right, you're still legally shredded, and you only have glute dense." But I was still affected by the diet. And he noticed that during my presentation, I was just kind of leaning against the wall. And anyone who's seen me present in my probably more normal state, I tend to walk all over the place and talk, and I'm a little more animated. And I was kind of like in chill mode. And he was like, yeah, I noticed that. And he's got an eye for that because he does, preps bodybuilders and stuff like that as well. So I think people just might not appreciate how it goes more than step count or just how lazy are you, that this is stuff that really you don't have conscious control over.
Yeah, and I believe, Herman Poncer, I think, has done a lot of work about constraining energy expenditure when you try to manipulate it through more active activity levels or actively increasing your activity levels. One of the cool things, I think the study with the cycling where they did the weight replacement and they still found less energy expenditure. If it's the same ones I'm thinking of, they showed over the course of 2 studies that it actually preferentially affected the exercise done at low intensities, at the low wattages. And so I think they tested 3 different wattages for cycling. And it was funny how they did segmental DEXA and put little weight plates in their pants to make sure that because I think it was leg cycling unless I'm wrong, but they did.
I think you're right.
But yeah, it was the low intensity stuff, which sucks even worse because it's like that's you walking around your house, that's you going to get the mail. And yeah, your body, again, this probably all goes straight back to the hypothalamus. Your body has a really tricky way of making sure that it's not doing destructive things when it comes to allowing you to get as lean as you'd like.
And think about it, if it had actually showed less energy expenditure at high intensities, that would be like a monumental finding for endurance sport. Like, oh, we just got to diet you, and all of a sudden, it takes less ATP for you to be at a high intensity. Oh, no, it didn't work. All it's going to do is make you burn less calories while you're doing the dishes and harder to lose weight. Great.
Well, this depends on your view of research. It was still less, but it wasn't statistically significant, Eric, which means we can't consider it and we have to ignore it and throw it out.
Absolutely, doesn't matter at all. And observationally, to then now not joke, if we look at the top level athletes who are propelling their own body for any kind of length or distance, whether that's 100 meters or the Tour de France, they're lean. You know, they find a way to weigh less so they can move themselves over large distances competitively. So,
what I noticed.
Omar, are you going to say something, brother?
Yeah, my man. What I was going to say is two things. First, what I noticed when Eric was prepping and we would do a podcast every single week, the one thing that I noticed, and I can assume with Brandon, because he was also prepping, the cadence, the rhythm of his speech was probably slow, because I saw videos of him before just to prep for the episode. He was markedly slower. With you, Eric, you were on point because Eric's just that guy. But the one dead giveaway, if you watch the video versions of the podcast, your eye blinks were very slow. So everything else was normal. You're just like, you're conducting yourself, you're Eric Helms, you know. But everything else, and then you'd blink like this. Like it was actually like that. And I noticed that degradation over time. That was the only sign that I saw from you.
It's like you can't hide it completely. Like my mission is always to have my preps affect those around me as minimal as possible.
Yeah.
But can't do it completely. There is some death of the soul when you do bodybuilding, no matter what.
Dead Souls, Nikolai Gogol, check it out. I was gonna say Trexler. I have a question for you, for both of you, being coaches, have coached a lot of different people. I want to talk about the societal expectations because you both hit on something I found interesting in that people coming to this episode that are interested learning about metabolic adaptation, there's kind of that idea that maybe we're unique or, oh, like, is that what's happening to me when I want to get lean? Where you both brought up examples of individuals or yourself where your calories to lose weight past a certain threshold are lower than what you would expect. And what it made me think of is, one, I'm thinking about my ex, Jazz, who, when I was helping her lose some weight, she was incredulous when I told her, and keep in mind, guys, that she's barely 5 feet, a very sedentary individual. And that's no insult to her, but just what she does day to day, you know, working from home, filming YouTube, cool. 1,600 calories. Incredulous, right? That I need to only have 1,600 calories. And then you bring up Eric, of course, that's further down the road, but you're a grown ass man, 6 feet, eating, 1,400 calories, and just how people, there's that disparity between what they think they'll need to eat to get lean and what they actually have. And I just want to hear both of you, your perspective when it comes to society, because it makes me think of someone like Jazz, who's a little person who's, honestly like 5 feet, or other people that are not the average. They're less than the average when you go to a restaurant, right? There's not 2 serving sizes when you go to McDonald's, when you go to Chipotle, when you go to even Subway. They try the 6-inch thing, but food portion sizes, and so our expectations, I think, are set for the average, even if you're not the average. So everyone that's below the average. And so I'm wondering if you guys could comment on that from your experience coaching individuals, the reality that they basically have to eat less than what they think, and then also setting them up, because I really like what you said, Helms, about adherence, setting them up for compliance, where that's the more important issue rather than trying to quantify the metabolic adaptation that is occurring.
Yeah, I mean, the expectations are tough. And, if it's somebody who's like Helms, if you're working with somebody who's been in the game for a while, then they know the drill. But if it's somebody who's never had to dig that deep and get their calories that low, it is something you have to kind of address and say, like, so here are some strategies for when you go out to eat. And man, Helms, you spent about 35, 45 minutes trying to order some food in London. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Helms was at the damn table. he tried every permutation of items on the menu, and they're like, we absolutely cannot do that.
Yeah, there was a situation, and I'm not going to name the restaurant. And mind you, I have been in situations in prep where I've eaten out twice a day for a full week and kept myself on the course of the diet. So this is the outlier. And I was looking at the thing like, okay, they have a fish dish here, but it's got some weird stuff in it. They got a chicken dish here, and I try to primarily eat things that I feel are sustainably caught when I eat fish, and normally stay away from things that are factory farmed, purely just because I'm a softie with ethical opinions about animal care. But anyway, so I just simply ask for, can I just get the lean fish here and just put that on this salad? And they're like, we can't do that. And I was like, well, I mean, is the salad pre-made? No. Okay, so can I just order this salad's vegan right here? It's just what it says. Correct. And I was like, can I just add the fish from here? And like, no. Okay, can I add the chicken breast from there? Chicken breast, that's got to be pretty easy. That's not cooked in anything. No. Okay. And I ended up, no shit, I had to order the chicken sandwich, hold everything except for the chicken, and then the vegan salad, and add it to that. And I paid for 2 meals.
Oh, man.
And that was the only way they would let me do it. And
I spent so much time apologizing for you to that poor waitress. I felt so bad for what
I'm
you
the
put her
bad
through.
guy. And the thing is, I stayed polite with her too. And I was happy to pay.
You did.
I was happy to pay.
You did.
Good.
I've never seen a more difficult scenario for ordering, so that's where the bar is set. But you did your absolute best. You were very polite.
By the way, saying I was happy to pay, meaning I was happy to let our hosts pay, so I kind of feel bad about that.
yeah, Helms was like, screw it, I'll get 3 entrees. I don't really care, like whatever it's gonna take.
Can you order me the prime rib and throw it away, please? Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, it's you can give people some tips and tricks on how to deal with ordering when they're at a restaurant, and how to address functions with their friends and family. Like when, your grandmother says, you must try this cookie, and you think, well, I don't want to be rude, but I also have to be on stage and not wear much clothing in 4 weeks. How am I going to navigate this situation? And so, there's little things to help people out with on that. But the best way to approach it is try to, as Eric alluded to earlier, try to make sure that you're not affecting those around you in a super annoying way. Try to manage that to the best of your ability, but also stay true to yourself and say, hey, these are things that are important to me. And as long as I'm not, ruining everybody else's day, theoretically, they should be pretty okay with me just kind of doing my thing. And if you're hanging around people that are in that situation, I think it's best not to dwell on it. Like, I think other people get uncomfortable when they're at a table with a bodybuilder who's like prepping, and they're like, I'm going to make a joke about this to like kind of, I feel weird about the fact that they're not eating, so I'm going to like comment about it. And that's okay. I mean, it's not like the elephant in the room. Like a bodybuilder would be like, yeah, whatever. But you should also consider that every time that bodybuilder has eaten near somebody in the last like 6 months, that's happened. So you don't like have to comment on it. You can just be like, oh, interesting. Cool. Helms likes to get 2 entrees. Anyway, back to my meal. But yeah, it's this weird thing where if people dwell on it too much, you're like, I was next to somebody who was prepping that's not you, and like everybody at the table kept bringing it up, and I was like, I mean, he's not going to cry himself to sleep, but like he's probably not eager to like keep talking about it. Like he's just trying to eat his, do his thing.
And the funny thing is, it's kind of like a lose-lose. So, for example, that was probably the only meal where I had to order something weird, because it was a restaurant that was just like a real fine dining experience, and there was literally nothing on the menu where you got an entree and the fat was probably under. Let's put it this way: there's nothing on the menu where the fat was under, say, 50 grams for the meal that also had a protein source. So there were some vegan options, and I was late. I'm like, I guess I go back to my room and like eat Greek yogurt on top of this. But I've also been up for 32 hours because I just came from New Zealand to the UK, and I don't want to do that. I just want to go home and sleep like I'm literally for the first time ever trying nicotine gum that Greg gave me just to stay conscious to talk to people. So it was just a rough night. But here's the other thing. 2 days later, we go to a restaurant and I just order something stock standard off the menu and don't say a word. Yeah, can I get the fish fillet with baked potato and leave it plain, and then move on to the next person. And people start making comments because it's so out of character. Like, oh, you're eating a restaurant with us, great, man. You're a week out and you can eat. That is amazing. I don't know how you do it. This is great. And so I think it's kind of like you either are weird for being weird, and that's something you talk about, or you're different. But I think also some of that's the fact that I was, as a presenter, I'm a semi-public figure in this small little corner of the world where I was presenting. But it's a funny thing to where I have been able to keep it very, very, very normal for the most part and adjust it. But there are sometimes you just can't, and there's no way around it. And so I agree with Eric. But I think he covered very well some of the kind of nuances of the way you navigate things during prep. But one thing, going back to your question, Omar, that I think is important is it does come down to that societal perception of, going back to what Eric said, the sticker shock. So, and some of it's not logical. It's just kind of based on what is our impression of what a hard diet is or not. So for example, if you are a 180-pound male and you're saying, I'm dieting, yeah, I'm on 1,800 calories, people will nod and go, oh yeah, you're pushing it, But if you're a 120-pound female and you're on 1,200 calories, people think there's something wrong with that, even though both are 10 kcals per pound. And in fact, the male is on proportionally less calories per their energy expenditure because they have a lower percentage of their body as fat mass and therefore has a slightly higher energy expenditure. So it's kind of one of those things, like you said, with Jazz, where 1,600 calories is kind of that threshold where it doesn't really matter how much you weigh, how tall you are, what your energy expenditure is. Anything below 1,600 is kind of seen as, that's a crash diet. Even though that may very well be, for a 5-foot person who's sedentary, maintenance calories are potentially like
surplus,
a slight push into a surplus if they're quite sedentary. And that's kind of just this one of those things where if I'm not working with a competitor or with someone who has a specific weight target, like trying to make weight for the 63 kg class as a powerlifter, I am going to try not to emphasize numbers, especially if they are someone who has previously failed on that approach. Like I was talking about the consultations where I've had someone for the 10th time not getting there. I'm going to emphasize, all right, let's develop habits. Let's set a meal schedule. And I want you to build a menu based on what you normally eat. But let's just try to make sure we're hitting body weight protein. No other number matters. I just want you to think, all right, I want a fruit, a vegetable, and a reasonable starch serving at three of the 4 your meals, and one of them just being protein. And let's see what that looks like. And let's try to get you as satiated as possible. And then once they stall from there, then you look at the numbers. And sometimes you'd be surprised. Like the way we view macros and the way we view a meal plan, if we're not given the macros, can be very different. Like if I told you, I woke up this morning and I had 2 poached eggs, some smoked salmon, a grilled tomato, sauteed spinach, and some cooked mushrooms. And then for lunch, I had, a mango, a banana, an apple, and some soup with tuna in it. And then for dinner, I had a kind of a summer vegetable salad with potatoes, yams, and kale, feta, and a little bit of lean meat in there. And then before I went to bed, I had Greek yogurt. I'd be like, man, that's a lot of food. And I'd be like, no, that was 1,800 calories. Like people, like the perspective, if you tell them all the foods you're eating when you have a very healthy diet that's controlling energy intake versus the macros of it, are very different. And when you have someone just focus on habits and eating the foods that are going to keep them very satiated while also keeping a high protein intake to support muscle retention, they might habitually just go to some level that they would have previously considered poverty macros just out of their natural ad libitum feeding behaviors once you modify that. And I think then they'll look at it very differently once they've had that experience. And when I was at those rock bottom numbers where I was just straight up at the bottom, basically I was just on a protein modified fast where I had veggies, 1 or 2 pieces of fruit, and then fat-free protein sources all day. And that it wasn't that bad. Like I could still work in miso soup. Like that's like 50 calories, chuck some canned tuna in there, throw some hot sauce on some egg whites. You're still eating, and yeah, I was hungry. Yeah, it was not ideal, but it's a lot different than looking at it as, oh my God, I'm on 1,200 calories. I'm going to die because 1,200 calories. So I think quantifying things does change the perspective of people a lot, and it's sometimes not productive. And I think that's my perspective is shifted now, where I will bring out counting and tracking once other things have failed. And actually, that's not true. I'll bring it out initially to help them understand which foods have which calories, which macros, and why they're useful tools. Then we'll pull it out, use behavior focused changes, and then once they stall on that, then we'll bring them back in to go, okay, we need to figure out let's get under the hood here again. But only then. And with the recognition that there is a cost to then using a quantitative approach.
I've got a thing to say that's probably not useful. That's me really hyping myself up here. But so my diet last time I prepped got similar to what you were describing, where it's like realistically we're talking lean protein and some really fibrous vegetables, and that's pretty much what you got. Mm-hmm. And I actually thought it was pretty fine. Like, it was not that bad. So I kind of had the similar experience, and that to me really shifted my perspective on eating in general. Like, once you're there at the phrase you used was at your rock bottom. But once you're there, like, ever since, I honestly, like, when I put together a diet, it's like your fat better be 0.6 or 0.7 grams per kilogram. You might go a little, I've seen you go a little lower than that on recommendations, but not by much. But I consider that to be kind of a minimum for me, 0.6 grams per kilogram of fat. My protein, at least 1.8 grams per kilogram body mass. And honestly, I subconsciously view all carbs and fat beyond that to be energy supplements to support performance. And that's not a normal way to view food that I would necessarily push on a general population person. But for me, it has been really helpful that, like, if I do have to cut calories, I'm like, I feel like I was taking some kind of like a pre-workout carbohydrate energy supplement. And it's like, oh, I can't take my supplement anymore. But like, that's like the weird way that my brain views food now. But in a way, it's like really liberating, where when I lose food, I'm just like, all right, like, it's not that big of a deal. I just like lost some of those extra calories that were supposed to help with performance, you know?
I do think that's useful, because I think sometimes we get so focused on trying to feed people as much as possible while losing weight, because we think that's going to therefore translate into better maintenance or a healthier weight loss. And to some degree, that's sort of true. But when you look at cohorts of obese individuals with obesity who are able to maintain weight loss, one of the things that predicts it is losing a lot of weight initially, really building that momentum, feeling like it's possible, and making stark changes in your behavior, because clearly the behavior you had before was not conducive to your goals. And I think there's something to be said for figuring out what is a 1,200 calorie diet when you've previously been eating 4,800 calories to maintain your weight. There's no way around that except for drastically changing your life. And then it also gives you a lot of fun places to go from. So I've actually been very successful back in the day when I was working with some very heavy clients who were at a point when they were ready to make a change. I think that's probably the biggest piece, where I put them on that essentially. Like, what's the bare minimum diet? Like, what is the protein intake we need to support the training we're doing? How do we make sure our micronutrients are covered? I looked at it as, I want a certain amount of fruits and vegetables, I want a certain amount of protein, then I want the most satiating foods, and let's pile a bunch of veggies on there. Give you some fish oil supplements and a multivitamin, and that's it. And then just be very honest with me and talk to me about when you feel like this is getting hard or unsustainable. And we're clocking, 2, 3, 4 pounds of lost a week. That's great. You're feeling fine. It starts to get hard. No problem. We can add 1,000 calories and you're still losing a pound a week. And all of a sudden now you're actually looking at a calorie intake that might be close to where you're going to be maintaining down the line, and you get practice at that. And we can modulate that up and down, all the while still losing weight and blowing your mind because you thought it was impossible, and teaching you new skills, and you learning about, what is the skeleton? What's the foundation? What's the basis of the backbone of this diet that is always there? Something I call for bodybuilders the default diet, which I like to use as a way to really make the transition between contest prep and the off season and the recovery diet or reverse diet, whatever you want to call it, easier. Is that, the quantitative values change, but the behaviors, if they're stable, makes those transitions so much better. So what I call the default diet is that backbone. It's basically what's the lowest low you get to, the exact perspective you gave, where everything else is an energy supplement that makes sure we have the minimum amount of protein we need, fruits and vegetables, and a minimum amount of fat intake. And once that's satisfied, that might be the darkest days in your prep, and you can still use that as your skeleton in prep, during a refeed, and you add a bunch of carbs. Like you add a carb source to every meal, boom, we call that a refeed. You add a carb source and a fat source, or a higher fat version of the dairy and the meats you're eating, and now it's called the off season, and then you simply just modulate those portion sizes and allow things like outside of the bounds treats, or replacing one of those meals with a meal out where you just get pizza or whatever and don't care about it, to get you to the appropriate level of rate of weight gain that we need in the off season to keep pushing you towards your goal. And I think that creates this stable habit base that sustains you through all phases of your career as a bodybuilder that you can rely on, rather than just going, I'm eating by the numbers. I come from the If It Fits Your Macros community, and now, man, I've got all these numbers to play with. The wheels are off, but every day looks a little different. And now that I'm not handcuffed, it's so hard to keep myself believing that it's important for me to hit this 400 grams of carb mark. Why don't I hit 800? Oh my God, it turned into a binge, which I think is a lot harder to do when you're like, I finished lunch, I'm going to be eating at dinner, and then I have a pre-bed meal of protein. Okay, I have to actually make the decision to go downstairs, go to Taco Bell and order food outside of the structure I have, rather than having no structure where that could very easily happen. And you go, I'll just make it up for in the back end. And you don't, So that's something I think is really important.
Yeah. Now Taco Bell did really restructure their menu like a couple years ago. I'm serious. I went to Taco Bell a couple years ago and had a really pleasant dining experience, and I told all my colleagues about it, and they thought I was lying. They're like, "You didn't eat Taco Bell." I'm like, "Hell yeah, I did," and I had a very nice time. So Taco Bell,
sponsor us.
Keep up the great work. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't let the haters get in your head. Helms doesn't know what he's talking about.
So you heard it here. You're going to hear the PETA sponsorship of Iron Culture and the Taco Bell sponsorship of the Stronger by Science.
That basically
so you choose which one you're more comfortable with.
Yeah.
That says everything. I think that really tells the whole story about.
Dude, I would so much rather
systems.
have Taco Bell. Are you kidding me? They would give me like gallons of the weird they have these Mountain Dew varieties that like don't exist in any other part of the universe. Like you go to Taco Bell, they have like 9 versions of Mountain Dew. I don't know how they did this.
But Derek, what they don't give you is moral superiority, which we have. So thank you.
To each their own. I'll take the Mountain Dew.
Fair enough, Aaron.
Mountain Dew Code Red is a highly underrated flavor, let me just say.
Oh, Code Red is good. There's also an orange version that's quite good.
Wow.
Wow. I forget what they called that one, but if you say orange, they'll know what you mean.
Yeah, they don't yet have Taco Bell here in New Zealand. I think we're probably just way too far south of that border to have that bell. But
right.
But fair enough. Hey, Eric, I think we might be, and Omar, correct me if I'm wrong if you've got some questions. We're at this point in the podcast where we open it up to the guests to say, hey, is there anything in this whole arena of metabolic adaptation, and more correctly, energy expenditure adaptation, that we haven't covered that you think we'd be remiss not to?
Yeah. I usually don't comment while doing an episode, but I've been loving this one. So, Trexler, if you want to say anything.
About, I think if I had something to kind of say about this topic that I wish people would, like I said to start out, I wish people would consider it but not worry about it. I think people give it a little bit too much power over. It's like like people treat it like it's this unknown thing that we can't quantify, but you definitely don't want. Like it's like we're in the hull of a ship in like the late 1600s, and it's like there's this thing, people's teeth are falling out and they're dying. Like in 20 years we'll figure out it was scurvy, but we don't know what it is or like how to fix it. But if you get it, you're screwed, and like you're definitely gonna die. I feel like it's this nebulous thing for a lot of people, and it's like, dude, it's fine. If we run into it, we'll get around it. It's not a big deal.
We have the oranges.
We have the oranges and the lemon juice, and it's fine. So that's one part. Another part is I think a lot of people are worried about how to prevent it. And I think when you look at like the best the best thing we could maybe hope to offer you in terms of preventing it or mitigating it, it basically just reads as a bodybuilding best practices list. And like some of these aren't even necessarily for metabolic adaptation. They're just dealing for what happens with metabolic adaptation when you lump in the fact that the hypothalamus doesn't just affect energy expenditure, it affects all these different hormone cascades. So like people like to say, oh, I've got, metabolic adaptation and low test. And it's like, that's the same thing. Like those are linked and they all feed back to the hypothalamus. Or, also my thyroid numbers are out of whack. And it's like, follow that up. So I think people should take a more comprehensive approach to metabolic adaptation and all the endocrine effects that kind of stem from it, and treat it more comprehensively, and not just think, what strategies can I use to mitigate this drop in metabolic rate, but what strategies what things in my prep are contributing to some of these endocrine dysfunctions, like this dysfunctional effect on this whole cascade of hormones that start with the hypothalamus. What are the ramifications of that, and what habits am I doing that are contributing to that could be potentially changed? And so that's why, like, is cardio giving you metabolic adaptation? No. But are you training the hell out of yourself and causing all sorts of chaos that you don't need to be dealing with from an endocrine perspective? Probably. And so the thing that separates me from a lot of people when they talk about metabolic adaptation is I like to keep it as a more comprehensive concept that also deals with kind of the tertiary effects. So I hope people will begin viewing it that way and not just a metabolic rate thing, which is why anytime you see me write about it, obviously I cover the metabolic rate stuff, but I also talk in great detail about the other endocrine effects that make contest prep suck, that we either need to deal with the ramifications, or we can even tailor our contest prep strategies to try to attenuate those. So I think that's kind of my 2 cents on the topic.
No, well said, man. I appreciate that. And where can people find more about your work if they want to read these articles and they're not familiar with you and who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So recently I started the First Fitness podcast with a dear friend of mine named Greg Nuckols. So if you want to find us, our website's strongerbyscience.com. We've got the podcast.
Are you saying, I'm sorry to interrupt, are you saying that he's now more of a permanent figure on the podcast?
I thought he was a temporary co-host.
No, he's not. Certainly not permanent by any means. He's a dear friend.
Okay.
The friend thing is permanent,
right.
But we've got a very clear understanding that I'm actively kind of shopping around for a better solution when it comes to co-hosting duties.
Good decision, honestly.
Yeah, he uses a lot of profanity, which the sponsors don't like. A lot of profanity that I've been trying to
Taco Bell really cares about their prestige these days.
That's
Taco Bell's a family company, and they don't want to be associated with that. So, but he's doing a fine job for now. And so we've got the podcast and the website, strongerbyscience.com. We also work on something called Mass that some of your listeners might be aware of. So,
can you tell us more about that and where people can find it?
Yeah, so Mass is a monthly research review where some of the best and brightest minds in the fitness industry and in the academic field of sports science, we review the 10 most interesting studies that happen every month, and you can find it anywhere, really. I mean, it's everywhere. You can't throw a rock without hitting a Mass subscription. It's so ubiquitous these days.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much anyone who's anyone, anywhere, anyhow, has a subscription, I would say, at this stage, right?
And if they don't, you shouldn't be associating with these people. You really got to keep your friend circle trimmed down. If there's people that aren't...
Yeah, but be a missionary first. Don't let them burn in ignorance. Like, let them know, hey, I understand you're not a subscriber, and because I come from a place of love and I respect you, let me save you. And where you need to go is strongerbyscience.com/mass. And full disclosure, just because of how ubiquitous it is, it just so happens that both Eric and I are reviewers for Mass. I mean, really anybody who anyone is. I mean, if you're not writing for Mass, you're probably subscribing. It's just what people do these days.
Mm-hmm. And there are also people not named Eric that write for it. So it's Greg Nuckols and Mike Zordos as well. the other half of the team, and they do good work as well. It's not Eric level work, but it's still quite good. So you can subscribe to Mass, and if you want to find me on social media for the really juicy gossip that I put out on all my avenues there, my Instagram handle is @TrexlerFitness. I am starting to post more. And that's a commitment.
Your take on Kylie Jenner now finally being single was spicy, let me just say.
Hey, Omar, somebody had to say it. I just wish it wasn't me.
I love because the reality of your Instagram is basically you just hitting add to story when other people post things about you and doing nothing else. But yeah, we'll go with that.
Hey, listen, Eric, we all have our own content strategies. Mine is very passive, okay? No, so this is unfair because I actually today made 2 new Instagram posts that will be going up. They are research-based. They have figures that I made myself.
You made them, so it's not just giving something that Greg gave you to post. This is great.
No. So I actually made a very nice template in R. The statistical software. I'm making my own figures. I really am going to be posting more in the near future. So make sure you get on the ground floor of that. Be one of the first to follow @Trexler Fitness, and you'll get the real scoop.
I cannot wait.
Well, let me just say that I have honestly, really and truly, thoroughly enjoyed this episode. Eric Trexler, what started first as animosity, as palpable, tangible, very real, this long-standing feud between the Erics has, I would view it being harmoniously concluded, a harmonious resolution. I now do see you guys like, and I knew when I said the seminal film, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Double Impact, where 2 estranged brothers working together. You're welcome, and I'm speaking for Eric Helms when I say this, you're welcome back anytime because you're good people. I'm a big fan of your fan, and I just want everyone to know that everything that Trexler mentioned, T-Rex, Texas Mex, mentioned is linked in the description to check out. And you do, Eric, before we end this, you do online coaching still, yes? Via Stronger by Science.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So definitely.
And I'm in charge of our whole coaching team. So we've got a whole team of coaches that does a really nice job. So even if my roster is full, we've got somebody that can help you out.
Yeah, definitely check it out. I want to thank everyone. The Iron Culture. We might not be the first fitness podcast, but the reviews speak for themselves. Besides that shit sandwich remark, you can leave a rating review. You can help us out. We do read them. You just heard that we read one out loud at the beginning of this. And if you're on YouTube, we're there too. Leave a comment. We do our best to try and respond to people. Iron Culture, history, science, culture, every single Monday. Finally, something to look forward to on a Monday. We'll catch everyone in that next episode.